Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we continue with our question and answers. Because, dear listeners, you sent so many questions to us over the last 5, 10, 15 episodes that we really need to get to it. We really need to answer them. We've done a number of episodes on this already, answering your questions, but there's still so many that we really want to answer. And because we love it so much when you interact with us, this is why we're going for this today. Hi, Jesse. Another week, another podcast, as I always say. Here we are. I've already said it in the introduction, so another Q&A session to answer some of these questions. Our very interested, keen and eager audience is sending to us, or that they have been sending to us. So I don't have anything else. Perhaps without much further ado, shall we start with the questions, or do you have anything else that you would like to say before we start?
No, I'm happy that all of you out there listening and watching sent us questions. This is part of the fun thing. I also work in education, also teaching, and so I like when people who are interested have questions. I should also add that listeners and viewers out there, if you're thinking, hey, I might have a question, how do I get on board with this? You can have us answer your questions as well, or at least have a chance, depending on the volume. I don't want to make too many promises. Your best chance, if you would like to ask us a question, is to become a part of our members community. And you can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. There we also have an exclusive area called the War Room, where we produce extra content that you don't find on the regular publicly facing podcast. And you can join that for a free month trial if you like by using the code DEEPDARKWOODS, all one word. So, back on track here after our little pitch for the War Room and for supporting the podcast and for getting your question answered. So be like Bruno, who asked this question. Now, he added a little bit of context to it, but I'll try and distill it down to get the ball rolling for us here. Bruno's question is this: how did Germany's defeat in World War II, or the Second World War, shape the stab in the back myth regarding the First World War? My understanding is that many Germans, even if they weren't all enthusiastic Nazis, in this case still being Bruno, did believe some version of the narrative that its armies had not been really defeated in World War I. And then he asks if people really kind of kept believing that after the more total defeat in World War II, or if that changed the way people saw the end of the First World War as well. It's an interesting question. It speaks to me because I'm very interested in the First World War. But Matthias, why don't you get the ball rolling with this one?
I mean, this really is a big one, isn't it? Again, I keep saying that, dear listeners and dear viewers, that we need to do more episodes and this and that and the other. And I think this is probably one if we really want to do it justice. So, but let's start. Let's try to keep it reasonably short because we have a number of questions. But let's have a stab at it at the this particular
stab in
myth.
the back.
There we go. That's exactly it.
Famous German humor.
Isn't it world renowned? Absolutely. So I'm assuming that most of you know what the stab in the back myth is. Just in case you're not very familiar with this, in a nutshell, so the stab in the back myth says that when the First World War comes to an end and Germany surrenders, that the German army had not been defeated in the field, but that you have groups in Germany, and the normal and the usual suspects are socialists, are Democrats, and of course the Jews, kind of stabbed the army in the back at the home front, from the home front, and that forced the army to make peace, to collapse, because they had been undermined by all these ideas of socialism, and because you have a change in government. So basically the idea that these groups were willing to lose the war if that meant you get rid of the Kaiser and you have some sort of democracy, and the left, for a better term, would come into power. This is the general idea. Now, of course, if you are a frontline soldier in 1918, and now, of course, we need to go a little bit into the area of our sister podcast that deals with the First World War, but bear with me. So if you're a frontline soldier in 1918, the German one, you of course know that Germany is beaten because you can see the sheer superiority of man and material of the Allies on the Western Front. You're fighting a withdrawal battle. So it's pretty obvious. The problem is that once you get home or once you move away from the front line, perhaps even when you're in the army, but further back, the situation kind of changes. Yes, people are suffering, people are starving, the situation is not great, but just basically looking at the map, it still looks as if Germany is at least kind of winning or holding out. Because when Germany surrenders in November 1918, there is not a single enemy soldier standing on German soil. And this is, to many people, this really confusing thing. So up to this stage, the German public at home had more or less been told, well, you know what, we're still winning the war. And suddenly, from one day to the next, no, by the way, we've surrendered and the Kaiser is gone. This is really quite confusing to people because they hadn't been told the truth beforehand. And of course, you then start looking for scapegoats, start looking for explanations as to what happened here and where and why did it all go wrong. You then have a number of factions, particularly right-wing groups. The Nazis use this, but they're not the only ones. You've got other groups as well. So all the right-wing factions that come up with this idea. And it's made really, perhaps you might even say famous in a trial, because Hindenburg, the great field marshal of the First World War, was brought to a trial where they tried to find out what happened there. How could Germany lose this war? And as he steps out, well, he basically says, well, we all know that the German army has been stabbed in the back, and he says there was a British general who used that phrase, and if a British general, the enemy is saying that, it must be true. And bang, there you had it. And suddenly you had this very, very easy scapegoat. And that, of course, could be used then going forward into the Weimar Republic. You got hyperinflation. You got all these hardships and the problems, because the situation in Germany, despite the roaring 20s and the golden 20s, was never really great for most people. So that's basically what you get. So the very easy answer and explanation. Have I forgotten anything there, Jesse, when we were talking about the First World War before we take it forward?
No, I think that's a good summary. It really does. This stab in the back myth gets a lot of prominent support. Also, Ludendorff writes his memoirs and is a prominent political figure in the 1920s as well. He's involved in this putsch, this coup attempt with Hitler in 1923, and he's pushing this idea as well. So all this propaganda during the war that kind of sunk into the German public's mindset that we're invincible and we should be winning this war and it's justified, the war. And all of a sudden, they've lost, and they've lost territory that everybody, socialists and conservatives, are upset in Germany that they've lost this territory in the peace treaty. So it becomes very, very central to the political discussion. And it has some support, especially on the right. And the Nazis then also make it a part of their centerpiece, right? Because it fits with the anti-Semitic ideas, right? You have these Jews and socialists who screwed us over in the war, and that's part of our worldview, and that's part of, our whole political program. So it becomes a pillar of the Nazi discourse in a way, leading up to the Second World War.
Absolutely. And when you then go into World War II, look at what the Nazis are doing, I think internally looking at the situation back home, you've got a two-pronged attack, you might say, because they look at what happened in 1918. And yes, everyone knows there was a revolution, because that was just obvious and the revolution happened. Of course, the question is, why did this revolution happen? Was it because people were just unhappy, or was it because, well, everyone was being stabbed in the back? And that is interesting, because when you look at the Nazi approach, it's two-pronged. On the one hand, they're trying to keep the population happy. As even well into the war, up to 1941, perhaps even 1942. Bit too strong, bit too simplistic, perhaps a bit too positive. But for the average German up to 1941, perhaps 1942, necessarily you didn't really notice there was a big war going on. You didn't have any hardships. So there was no rationing, or not hard rationing. The cinema stayed open till early 1945. All these things. This only really changes in 1943. So the slogan was, it was cannons and butter. So because you know that you want to keep the population happy, you don't want to have some sort of civil unrest which might lead to another revolution. On the other hand, when you go back to 1918, this idea that you have the socialists, you have the Jews, of course, what you're trying to do is you're trying to remove these not only from the political spectrum, but also, of course, from wider society. That's why you have concentration camps, for example, put them all in there. So you can see a relatively, I wouldn't say clever, but you might perhaps say thought through approach that you find here. And what you then have is the next step is that then when you go towards the end of the war, unlike in 1918, where people said, you know what, this is enough, and now we have to make peace, and even if we're still in France and Belgium, wherever, the war is lost, let's be sensible here, and let's make peace. That is very, very different in 1945. And it's really interesting to see that all these high-ranking generals and all these politicians like Hitler and the Nazi leaders, they always refer back to 1918. And they always said, the 9th of November will never happen again. And this is really very, very strong. Say, for example, if you have seen Downfall, the film, Hitler in the Bunker, there's one scene where there's a big argument between two of the leading generals, and one said, well, you're all crazy down here, why don't you just make peace? You can see the war is lost. And then the one guy, I think he's supposed to be Krebs, he basically just starts shouting, and he says, well, we went through this in 1918, we're not doing this again, we're fighting all the way to the end, even if that means we're basically completely annihilated, but this time we fight to the finish. So very interesting, you constantly have these links back that you find in Germany in 1945. And 9th of November 1918 must never happen again. Because this step in the back myth, of course, also means that if the army had held out just that little bit longer, these frictions in the Allied camp and all these other things would have meant that Germany would have been victorious, or at least wouldn't have been defeated. And there's always this idea, there's also this whole idea of, well, the wonder weapons that are coming. It's the V1, the V2, the jet fighter, all this other stuff. Well, if we get a few more of these, if we just wait another day, another week, another month, we're going to have the big, big miracle. And of course, there is a miracle that happens. And I think we talked about this in another episode when we talked about the end of Berlin. And this is, of course, when Roosevelt dies. And it's quite interesting because Goebbels rushes down to the bunker. He says, well, here it is. Here's the miracle, the second miracle of the House Brandenburg, as he calls it. I can talk about this in a minute because it links back to my favorite person, of course, in history, Frederick the Great, dear listeners. So, of course, in 1945, it doesn't change anything. Where it did have a big impact in German history, Prussian history, is, now I have to mention Frederick the Great, 7 Years' War, where Prussia was about to defeat it. The Tsarina dies, her son takes over, and the first thing he does is make peace with Prussia, and that's why Prussia survives. And so Goebbels thinks, like a lot of people, you know what, brilliant. So here is the big break. We've managed it. So unlike 1918, where we threw in the towel too early, we stuck with it, and now we can reap the rewards because now the coalition is going to fall apart. The Western allies are probably going to fight with us against the Soviets, whatever the consequence would have been. Of course, it didn't happen. And that, of course, meant that the defeat of 1945 was so absolute and so total as a defeat can probably be. Now I've probably forgotten something because I've rambled on for quite some time and covered a lot of ground, including, brilliantly, Frederick the Great. Very, very glad I managed to squeeze him in that early on to be perfect. Absolutely. So, but now I've most definitely forgotten something, Jesse. Fill in the gaps.
Actually, well, I'll show you this later. It's not visible behind me, but there is a portrait of Frederick the Great behind me.
Very good.
Just off screen. Anyway.
I've got one as well in my study. There we are.
I think that what you've just said brings us nicely to the kind of story of the myth after World War II, which is getting back to the heart of Bruno's question. How did that total defeat and undeniable, there's no conspiracy theory that can say that Germany was not going to lose the Second World War by 1945, by the time it's over. So then after that happens, Bruno's wondering, then after in the 50s and 60s and so on, Germans look back to 1918 and do they see it then differently? Do they then put a different emphasis on why Germany surrendered, why it was defeated? And of course, there's the stab in the back myth is then limited politically to the fringe of the far right. It's been discredited because of its association with German nationalism, with the Nazis and so on. So what replaces it then is as an explanation for how to think about Germany in the First World War and its defeat in the First World War is what Bruno's bringing us towards as the culmination of this question?
What you find particularly to begin with in the, let's call it the academic world, so the historians, because they look at the documents and they analyze things, and then from there, the arguments, the ideas then basically move and filter down into the wider public's ear, so to speak. I think at that stage, it's pretty obvious to everybody that, well, even the First World War, the Germans had lost the war. A very, very different situation compared to 1945. Not a total defeat, but yes, Germany has lost the war. And I think if you then move forward from the 50s and 60s onwards, you can see that this is now very much accepted. So even today, well, it would be very difficult to find someone to say that Germany was winning the war in 1918 and it's all the Jews and socialists' fault. I mean, that's sorry, yes?
I could have waited till the end of your sentence, but except in YouTube comments.
Okay.
There you can find many people who maintain that fantasy, but go on. I'm just jaded.
And I think one thing that is really interesting, one thing that gets overlooked quite often when you look at German history as well, is that Germany is probably one of the only, perhaps the only country that does not have any state secrets, any hidden or locked away documents all the way up to 1945. Because when World War II comes to an end and the Allies take over and occupy Germany, they also take over the military archives, the political archives, all these things. Every nation after 1918 published their explanation as to why the First World War had happened, how it been fought, who was responsible, all these things. Every nation did that. And of course, these are selected documents because you do not want to present yourself in a bad light. This changes after 1945 because the Allies go into the archives, take everything out there, even the state secrets, the secret correspondence between people, and all this is accessible, all this is published. This is most of the time taken away, either to Moscow or even Paris or London or Washington. Even today, I think I've said this in a different podcast already, when you go to the German military archives, sometimes you still only get photocopies of documents from World War I and World War II because the originals are in London or are in Washington. If they're in Moscow, you quite often don't even know they're there because they're locked away. But that, I think, is also very, very important to remember because by here, everything is on the table. Everything is out in the open. That does not necessarily apply in the same degree to most of the other nations. So it's very easy to kind of analyze the German side. A bit more difficult to still analyze the other side. But it helps to bust this big myth. That's what we're all about, as we know on this podcast, busting the myth. So busting the myth that Germany was victorious, able to win, or whatever in the First World War. So this myth is pretty much gone. And what you do find in Germany, really after 1945, is a change in this thinking. Has a massive impact as well on the German national psyche. The Germans quite often like to do things in extremes. You either want to take over the world or you want to tell everybody how to be particularly green, recycle your rubbish, and don't invade other people. That's very important. So that's where we are now, of course. So you can see there's always a slightly extreme streak in the German national psyche. We move from this militaristic one, the pendulum has swung all the way back to the other side, which now sometimes is causing problems because people say Germany needs to be more proactive. But Germans say, no, we're done. We've had enough. 2 lost world wars. That's enough for us. Thank you very much. Someone else's turn.
Well, who knows? The political tides are shifting a little bit in Germany, but we'll stay safely away from current politics if we can. One thing I would just add on to that, as far as dealing with the 1918 question after World War II, I think the 60s is a very important kind of turning point about that. And that is true not only in Germany, right? In the 60s, you have this wave of popular protest, a lot of young people, a lot of students. It's often left-wing driven, so then they come into conflict with their parental generation or parties on the right side of the political spectrum. 1968 is a big year in Europe, especially for protests in France and also in Germany. And in the midst of this, you have this historical kind of rethinking as well. And this is the time period when a lot of books are published in France and the UK as well about how the First World War was kind of pointless and an absurd remnant of this old world of aristocrats and kings and empires and that sort of thing. In Britain, our listeners in Britain will know the phrase, perhaps, lions led by donkeys. This is kind of a popular way of thinking about the First World War at the time. And one of the aspects that becomes quite prominent in the German discussion is, well, maybe Germany was at fault for the war. And there's a very famous book published by a guy called Fritz Fischer that creates a huge debate. He basically says, yeah, Germany was also at fault for World War I. So the experience of going through the Second World War causes some historians or journalists. Another prominent one was a guy called Sebastian Haffner, who wrote a book also in the 60s called The Seven Deadly Sins of the German Empire in the First World War, which makes for interesting reading, I guess you could say. Now, this is a huge debate, right? Because then you have conservative German historians primarily who say, no, yeah, Germany caused the World War II, but it's not that simple. Whereas, so you have this big discussion trying to replace, reposition, and reevaluate. And these historians like Fischer, who are extremely critical of Germany in the First World War, they're essentially kind of drawing this parallel. They're like, not only were we wrong in World War II, but that was such a terrible mistake that maybe we should look back at that other war and go against the grain and say, hey, actually, even though up until World War II, we thought we were completely justified for World War I, we weren't. And obviously, there's been a lot of discussion and writing about that since then. I don't think a lot of people fully 100% support Fischer's more extreme position that Germany kind of planned the war, First World War long in advance and blah, blah, blah. But that was a big part of the discussion. That was part of the reevaluation of the First World War as well. And one that I had to learn a lot about in grad school, I would like to add. So, Matthias, unless you've got something else for Bruno on the stab in the back myth, or have we?
I think your points there, of course, are very, very good. As we both also have an interest in the First World War, so we could now steal all the sandwiches of our sister podcast and talk about this. So maybe we just leave it here because we're supposed to be talking about World War II. So I've got some ideas, of course, some comments, but I saved them for another day. Maybe when we get invited to our sister podcast again to talk about the outbreak and the end of World War I. But leave it at that because I think we've covered this one.
All right. So the next question, I think you had selected one or two, Matthias, that you wanted to wrestle with.
So I've got one here from Louise. And she says, in Polish, I would refer to the forces associated with Germany that occupied Poland from 1939 to 1945, as my Polish isn't particular good, Niemcy nazistowskie, Polish speakers, please forgive me, which translates to Nazi Germany. But in England, and then in brackets, I think the wider UK too, and Anglophone world, could be wrong, close brackets, I would say Germans to refer to the same group situation. Is one of them more accurate, or is it irrelevant? Well, is one more accurate? Is it irrelevant? What do we think, Jesse?
Oh, well, now we're getting sort of philosophical here.
Now we are, very true.
The meaning of language and
there's a bit of that going
words.
On. Yeah.
Well, in a practical sense, in World War II, it's partly into those two ideas of Nazi Germany and Germany are kind of interchangeable in some ways because it's the Nazi regime that controls the country, the army, and that's usually what we're talking about in World War II. Where I find sometimes it's useful to distinguish, and where I do find sometimes in the English-speaking world we're a little bit sloppy, is when referring to the German population at large as Nazis or Germans as Nazis. There was a very, very successful graphic YouTube video several years ago now where they visualized all the statistics of the war dead. It was made by an American, I think, and it's done, I don't know how many tens of millions of views. but they had a very clever, very interesting, engaging way of, they had all these little icons of people, and they were talking about the death statistics and showing for each country. They had a huge pillar of these little icons, and they misspoke because of this kind of sloppiness that we have, and said Nazis instead of Germans when they were talking about millions and millions of German soldiers being killed, right? So there is sometimes, I think, a good reason to distinguish, and other times, especially if we're talking about the government, army, institutions, then I don't think it matters because they were Nazified at the time. So
I think you're right. I think there's also another aspect to this, another angle, and that's became apparent the very first time. It was the first time I really thought about this when I was on quite a few years ago now on a battlefield tour in Russia, when we could still go there, when we're still on speaking terms with Russia. And we had a Russian tour guide because you had to have one, and she was taking us around the Battle of Kursk. And it was interesting because most of what she said wasn't all that 100% accurate. You could see there was a lot of Soviet indoctrination still in that particular person, and the way she presented things, the way also she talked about the non-existence, as she would have said, support from the Western allies. All these things are quite interesting. And she kept talking constantly about the Nazis, Nazi Germany, the Nazis, Nazi Germany, the fascist Germans. And at one stage, through the interpreter, I asked her, so why do you constantly keep saying Nazis and fascists? Why is that? And she just looked at me completely confused and said, well, that's very simple, because that was then, the Germans now very different. And I thought, well, interesting, where do you get this idea from? And she then said, Comrade Stalin said that the Hitlers come and go, but the German nation will always remain, will always stay. So that was a bit of a moment where the penny dropped. So when you use the term Nazi Germany rather than Germans, you're trying to create a gap between population on the whole, perhaps also between modern day Germany and what happened in those days. Quite often, my personal experience when it's done in Eastern Europe, and I know, Jesse, you know that part of the world very, very well, so I'm not quite sure if that aligns with your experience. When people use that term, it's normally meant, in my experience, you might say in a slightly positive way when you then try to link this to modern Germany, because we kind of try to show that there's a difference between these two. When you go to other countries, perhaps in the West, that's not necessarily always the case in my experience. You find the same thing in Germany right now as well, where people are constantly talking of the Nazis, Nazi Germany, Nazi this, Nazi that. And when you listen to how people use these phrases, and they don't say Germany anymore, they just say Nazism, Nazi Germany, what have you, it always feels a little bit as if people are trying to, again, create a gap between themselves, modern life, modern day Germany, and what had happened 80 years before. Which I personally, it's a personal view now, always find a bit, what's the right word, cheap. Because you shouldn't forget that these people were still your grandfathers, grandparents, great-grandparents. So I think it's a bit too easy to say we don't want anything to do with this anymore because they were so fundamentally different. I think that a very different approach needs to be taken. That's my additional view on this. Not quite sure what you think, Jesse, whether you think that's true. As I said, it all started when I was talking through the interpreter to this Russian lady, which I found really interesting.
Well, I think that as far as Eastern Europe goes, or former Soviet Union is concerned, the story of the Second World War, the way of understanding the Second World War, is still bounded by similar political needs and propaganda needs as it was during the war in some ways. And so I feel like this idea that you mentioned, where they still focus much more on that kind of terminology, it serves a few purposes. It can serve a few purposes. It can serve the purpose of putting distance between modern day Germany and at the time, or it can be a reminder that at the time anyway, until 1945, when they started thinking about what are we going to do with occupied Germany, and we don't want to alienate everybody. Before that, it was, everybody in uniform in our country who's invaded us is a fascist, right? And so you can pull that word, that phrase, in two directions. And I think in Eastern Europe, it can sometimes serve the one and sometimes serve the other. And if for a while you use it one way and then the politics change, well, you can rehabilitate it by using the same phrase and then switching that up a little bit, right? Which I think we do see some of in Russian public discourse these days as well. So it's a bit of a chameleon type of phrase in some ways. That's all I got for that. That's otherwise we're going to get too abstract about the the meaning of words and the philosophy behind it, and there's all sorts of like social science studies about the meanings of words and so on and so forth. But we won't go too far.
You've lost me now completely, I have to say.
You see, my thesis was about propaganda, right? So I was reading about all these French guys in the 50s who were like, yeah, but an image is actually a text, and the parts of the image are like words and grammar. I'm like, okay. I'll leave it at that.
Absolutely. I think that's a good idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. Otherwise, our listener numbers are plunging every time I talk about French social scientists from the 1950s.
Do we have another question? Have you got one?
Yeah. Yes, I have another one here from Alex. He asks about the ratios of fighting men to support troops during the Second World War. Sometimes this idea is called the tooth to tail ratio. So for every guy with a gun in his hand who's shooting at somebody, or for every guy who's sitting in a tank driving it in order to be able to shoot somebody, how many guys do you need who are pushing papers, filling forms, loading up ships, driving trucks full of food or ammunition or whatever? So how does that work? And is it different between the different belligerents in the Second World War? The short version is, I can't fully answer your question, Alex, without really getting into the research. But this question is notoriously tough to answer, because how do you really define that? So if you take the military as a whole, for example, everybody who's in uniform, the guy playing in the band, the recruiter who's back home, the female parts, the wrens or whatever in the UK and so on. If you count all of that, then obviously the proportion of your fighting troops is much, much smaller. But would you then count just the division, which is theoretically kind of the largest formation that can sort of fight independently? Well, then obviously your combat troop ratio is going to be much higher. Then how do you account for a corps that might lend some of its assets to a division? And then they have a more administrative command and control role, so it's going to be different. Some of the figures I've seen, just to throw out a few examples, but of course, as I say, these are very difficult to pin down, that for the US, I've seen different estimates for World War II, anywhere from 19% direct combat personnel to like 35% in the Second World War. Whereas, say, a conflict like Vietnam, the estimate I saw for US forces was something like 7% combat troops, right? And this changes depending on time, because you have more advanced technology. It's going to take more people to maintain it and fewer people to operate it sometimes. It also depends where you're fighting, because the Pacific War, spaces are vast. It's all islands, or mostly islands. You're going to need a lot more logistical resources than in Europe, where, yes, you have the Atlantic, but you kind of have one pipeline, right, going right to the front. Whereas the Pacific is spread over a much, much vaster watery distance, right? Just like Vietnam needed far more than the First World War because of the complexity, jungle, the way of fighting, of inserting and extracting troops here, there, and everywhere, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's enough of a starting point for you, Alex. A couple of examples and a little bit about the difficulty of answering that kind of question.
It is a very complex one, as you just explained, because you need to compare different armies, their different structures, and what is the main fighting unit, the main fighting formation. So you mentioned, for example, the division, which is the smallest formation, which is able to fight independently at the higher tactical or the operational of war, making use of the concert, you might say, the orchestra of combined arms warfare. Is that the main fighting body? Is it something else? So the structures are very, very different. In a nutshell, another thing that's also very important, again, you can talk about this forever till the cows come home, is philosophy of war. So you might want to lift it up a little bit. And what type of war are you fighting? What is the type of war that you want to fight, that you can afford to fight? And there you have a fundamental difference between the Germans and particularly the Western allies, perhaps more than the Soviets now. And the Western allies know that they've got more men, more material. This is here the important thing. So they can use lots of tanks, lots of guns, lots of ammunition. They can feed their people properly. All these things that come into play that, of course, also to beef up the logistical chain. And they also know that if they're going to fight the long war, they're probably going to win. Simply because they've got more resources. And they can, just like, for example, in World War I, they can just flood the battlefield and swamp the battlefield with man, material, what have you, and the enemy will simply just be overwhelmed. The German case is very different. The German case has always been very different because being in the center of Europe, surrounded by real or potential enemies, you know exactly that if you're going to fight the long war, you're going to lose because simply you do not have the manpower. Yes, you can operate on interior lines, so move the troops from one front line to the other front. And this is what the Germans do quite successfully. So even though overall they are quite often much weaker than the enemy, in the point where it really counts, the Schwerpunkt of operations, they're still able to concentrate force. But in the long run, it simply doesn't work. And that means that, and again, it's a very broad brush here now, that means that generally speaking, the Germans in World War II put more emphasis on the teeth arm, so the sharp end of the spear, the sword, whatever you want to call it, because they know when you go to war, you need to go in there, you need to go bang, whack the enemy. The enemy needs to fall over quite quickly, and this is how you win a war. So you can compare it, for example, to a boxing match. You want to knock out the enemy in round 1. If you have to go all the way to 10 rounds, you know you're going to lose. So this is what you need to do. And this is why they try to push as much as possible into the fighting units. And this is what you can see in the general structure, the order of battle, the orbit, and also the way they train people. Even I don't know, for example, cooks and clerks would undergo a basic training where they would learn to shoot a rifle properly. Of course, they're not 100% fully trained, but they're still better than their allied counterparts who quite often did not go through this because everyone knew this is not going to be expected from me. And this has advantages because when you send them in battle, yes, you might be numerically smaller and have more limited numbers. However, when it comes to the fight unit against unit, you can still be as strong, perhaps even stronger. The problem, of course, comes in once you go into this prolonged fighting, because sooner or later you will no longer have the logistical resupply that you need to run this war. And this is what you find. You find that, again, we've been talking about World War I quite a bit. You find in World War I, you find exactly the same thing in World War II, when the Germans are constantly in awe of, and particularly what the Americans have, just the sheer amount of stuff and equipment that they have. We never have this, we can't match this, we have to do things very differently. And that then quite often means they're putting bodies against grenades and artillery shells, and you can imagine who wins and what the casualties are. So there's some of the difference here. So it's structure, and quite often structure is the output, you might say, the result of a particular philosophy of war. And the Germans want to try to fight very differently, which you might say works very well in the first few years of the Second World War. 2 weeks in Poland, 6 weeks in France, that all works very well. The moment this concept doesn't work anymore, then you've got a problem. And this is, you might argue, one of the reasons, I mean, again, it's a big discussion, but one of the reasons from a pure military point of view, perhaps the main reason why Germany in the end actually loses. So Germany is winning itself to death. It's winning lots of battles, but it's losing the war.
Yeah, that happens a lot. The US has done that in a couple of its conflicts in the 20th century as well. It reminds me of Napoleon, when he famously at some point said, I don't know if this is apocryphal, I think he actually said it though, where he said about logistics, l'intendance suivra. So the quartermaster corps, they'll just follow us. Like, we're just, me and the marshals, we're going to do what we need to do. We're going to send the men and the armies here and there because that's what our military genius supposedly is telling us to do. And yeah, all the guys with the carts and the oxen, they're just going to follow. It's just going to happen, which, both he and the Germans in 1941 found out is not necessarily the case. So much for that logistical side of things. I have one more question. I don't know
Okay.
if you have one as well.
I've got one, but let's go with yours.
All right. Well, this is a classic one, but one that I haven't thought about in a little while. Paul asked us, could the D-Day landings have been stopped? Now, I guess there's a short and a long answer to this. Obviously, the short answer is no fun. So we're going to go with a bit of a more thought out answer. I don't know. I'll start it off just for the
Go
fun.
for it.
Of course, in a way, you could say no. If you look at the resources available to the Germans, if you look at the situation of the navies, right? They're not going to be able to prevent it on the sea. They don't have the air force to prevent it either. So you're then reduced to saying, well, could they have prevented it on the land? And that was kind of their plan, right? That's why they had the Atlantic Wall. That's why Rommel insisted, if there's a landing, we need to throw it back immediately. And there, I think we have a little bit of leeway for discussion. Is there something the Germans could have done in response to those first hours or day or 2 days? Different? Could they have done something differently that maybe would have stopped the landings? Famously, the Allies were able to deceive them a little bit for a little while into thinking that maybe the main landing was still coming. It was going to be near Calais. So they kept a bunch of armored formations up there. You could maybe think, in a counterfactual, if they had immediately sent all that armor to Normandy instead of hesitating, maybe they could have had more of a chance of doing something. But my inclination is still that probably not.
I agree. Particularly if you look at where the Allies really land, say in Normandy, you look, as you already said, the German forces there. And even if you'd released the tanks earlier, would have made a difference? Probably not. I mean, there is the example of 21st Panzer that reaches the beaches, trying to push the Allies back into the sea. And that attack is then, to use the great tactical term, smashed up mainly by naval gunfire. So I don't think there is really any merit in this, and that probably wouldn't have happened. But it's also interesting, of course, to think, is this what the Germans really wanted? Did they want to stop the invasion on the beaches? And of course, there you are then into this really interesting discussion. Again, we need to do a whole podcast or a whole series on this. What is the German plan to counter the invasion? You already mentioned Rommel, of course. He says, no, we need to defeat them on the beaches. And that is the experience of having fought the Allies, particularly North Africa. When you look at air superiority, and he said we will simply not be able to maneuver inland, so we can't let them get in and then defeat the army somewhere inland. Whereas other people, it's part of this famous tank debate. The most famous guy here is a chap called Geyer von Schweppenburg. And he comes from the Eastern Front, so his experience of war is very different. And he says, no. What we need to do is we let them land, because we can't stop them anyway, because they've got ships and lots of air power. We let them land, we let them get inland, and then we defeat them, because, so his argument goes, when you look at the operation of level of war, the Wehrmacht is much, much better than the Brits and the Americans. And you can then defeat the forces once they've pushed inland. So you can see even the Germans are not quite sure as to what they want to do. Now, when you look at the Atlantic Wall, I mean, the Atlantic Wall was never meant to really stop an invasion. It's a tripwire. That's what it is, not more than that. Again, that's a slight misunderstanding. So when you look at the D-Day landings, of course, we concentrate very, very much on the landings themselves, because that makes sense. It's where the Allies get back to mainland Europe. This is where you might say, well, all of the exciting action happens. Well, really, in many cases, the action really only happens once you push inland. It does not apply so much in the American sector. Think about bloody Omaha and all these things. But in the British sector, most of these landings are, I wouldn't say unopposed. There's still some fighting. Of course, there are casualties. There are people getting killed. But the real fighting only happens once the British have pushed inland. For example, the Battle for Caen and all these other battles. I mean, we don't want to go into too much detail, because that really is a whole series of podcasts which we probably have to do. But that's an interesting one as well. So the answer is probably no. I mean, that leads to the next question, you might say. And again, we're going big here already. I mean, so if the Germans can't stop it, does it change the outcome of the war? How important is the landing? You might, of course, argue that by that stage the war is already lost, and because when you look at the land war is decided in the east, not the west. But again, that's a very, very big discussion. You've got about 40 German divisions in France that were supposed to be moved to the Eastern Front once the Allies have been defeated in the west. So you can see it gets very, very complex and very big, very strategic. So I think. That was a very long-winded answer now, wasn't it? No, we can't stop it. Well, I say we, you know what I mean. Yes. So.
All right. We have time for one more. If you had one other question on your list, let's tackle that, and then we'll be good.
Well, this one seems to be a relatively specific one. That's from Peter, and he said German military people and German commanders seem to be more. He says, weary or wearing more scars than their Allied counterparts. Why is this? Were they closer to the fighting? Well, why is this? Why does that happen? Any ideas? Are they closer to the fighting? Are they more heroic? Or can we think of any examples where people have more scars in their faces, for example? I've got an answer to this, but it's not a military one.
Well, I mean, I'll leave I mean, this is your area of expertise and not mine, but off the top of my head, I would say my understanding is that German generals were more likely to do a bit of risk-taking. They're also more subject to air attack. This is how Rommel gets gravely wounded, for example. But perhaps for some of them, there was and is a practice, at least in Austria, maybe also in Bavaria, where you have members of these nationalistic student groups called Burschenschaften. And sometimes part of the rite of passage of being a part of this old boys nationalistic club is you take a little sword and slice your cheek open, and then you have a little scar saying, "Hey, I'm a member of this group." You still see some people in Austria who have that scar today, in fact. But I don't know how many. It's called a Schmiss. And I don't know how many of those were really relevant as far as German World War II generals are concerned, but it's one of the things that just popped into mind. But Matthias, give us the real answer here. I'm just shooting from the hip.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what I would say. So you've got two different things. So the first one is German officers, or not officers, generals, or what have you, perhaps a bit more going to the front line, generally speaking. So when you look at the casualties that you find, they tend to be as a percentage higher amongst senior officers than in other armies. We have these famous episodes. You already mentioned Rommel, who was leading from the front. All that kind of stuff happens. That's it. But I'm kind of putting on my thinking cap here, my guessing cap, I would say, because when particularly looking at scars, there are a number of very, very, very famous pictures from German officers. And perhaps the most famous one is this SS guy, Otto Skorzeny, who's the guy who liberated Mussolini from this little from this hotel which served as his prison, and he's got a number of scars. And as you rightly said, so these are the Schmisse, because he studied in Vienna, and so he was in one of these fraternities. Well, I have to say I'm a member of a fraternity where we do a bit of fencing. If you're interested, people, you want to know how it's done, all this, it is very, as you already said, it's very kind of, shall we use the word archaic? It's very old-fashioned. It's very 19th century. It's also very, very German. You don't find that anywhere else in the world, I think. Well, unless you've got German-speaking word like Austria, and actually one or two in Poland, and there's actually a fraternity in Chile as well, which is very, very interesting. But I think this is the real reason why we have this here, because it was still in those days seen as a rite of passage. It's a badge of honor to have this particular scar in your face. You normally see them on the left cheek because that's where the blade hits you. Say this went out of fashion, so nowadays, well, there's still fencing going on, but you normally try not to get hit, because let's face it, when you get hit, it means that you're not so very good at fencing. So there we are, there we have it. But it is an interesting question, because you see this very, very often, not only in military circles, but generally speaking in the German academic world. all the way up to perhaps you might say the 1960s. You already talked about the changes in society in the 1960s, the 1968 revolutions, all these things. Up to that stage, you had, in many ways, the old elites. So there isn't really an hour zero, you might say, where everything changes in Germany and other countries because the old elites are still there. And these are the guys that would have gone through the old system. And in the old system, perhaps all the way up to the end of, well, you might say, well, I want to say 1945. Technically, that's not correct because the German fraternities, well, they disbanded in 1933. So they're told to do this. But you still have the ethos, so to speak. And that was whenever you went anywhere in academic circles, you would see these cars. Everyone would have them because in the old days, pretty much every student would be a member of a fraternity. Different types of fraternities. I want to go into too much detail because that's extremely
Culture specific.
Exactly. So if you're really interested in this, I mean, you can't really see it anywhere because all happens behind closed doors. There is a German institution, you might say, every Sunday evening. There is a film being shown. That's or basically it's a series, and it's called Tatort. So just type into YouTube, type in Tatort, Tatort, and then Mensur, Mensur, and a scene will come up that shows you how that fencing is done even still today. So, but it's all a bit different. But it's very specific, but I thought that was a fun one, not least because I know one or two things about these organizations. There we are. Over to you, Jesse.
So that wraps up our today's episode of Your Questions. And just as a reminder, if you would like us to, or if you would like your question to have a chance of being answered by us, I don't want to promise too much again, but you can support the podcast. You can do that by going to bothsidesofthewire.com. We also have what we call the War Room there, where we have exclusive content that's not publicly available. You can get a free trial for access to the War Room by entering the code Deep Dark Woods. So that was today's Q&A episode. Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming. Supporters out there, we enjoy it and we appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.